My name is Brenda Miller, and I was 36 the year my new sister-in-law decided to hijack a decade of my domestic labor and rebrand it as her own personal lifestyle triumph. She waited until I had spent 4 consecutive days brining, baking, and orchestrating a Thanksgiving dinner for 25 extended family members to stand in my dining room and attempt to steal the absolute center of gravity. My sister-in-law would later stand in my kitchen, her face flushed a deep, humiliating crimson, completely unable to explain how an heirloom recipe passed down from her great-grandmother possessed the exact, distinct flavor profile of bulk-manufactured preservatives. She genuinely believed she was a master of social manipulation who had effortlessly outshone the tired, working hostess. She had absolutely no idea that when you attempt to pass off a mass-produced deli item as a culinary masterpiece, you should never, under any circumstances, throw the commercial packaging into the recycling bin of a woman who works as a senior director of supply chain logistics. Welcome back to Whispered Drama Stories. We tell quiet, true-to-life family and relationship stories about boundaries, dignity, and the moment someone finally stops shrinking to fit a family narrative they never wrote. If a calm woman with an airtight timeline, a flawless understanding of inventory tracking, and a perfectly executed silent trap is your idea of justice, you are in the right place. People fundamentally misunderstand the mechanics of hosting a massive holiday dinner. To a civilian, Thanksgiving is just a Thursday where you eat too much turkey and watch football. But to the person actually hosting, it is not a dinner. It is a high-stakes, multivariable logistical deployment. It requires backwards planning a 48-hour timeline down to 15-minute increments. You have to calculate oven space algorithms, coordinate the resting time of the meat against the boiling point of the potatoes, and manage the delicate, volatile, emotional ecosystem of 25 relatives occupying the same heated square footage. I built my entire professional career on the principle of absolute, microscopic efficiency. I managed the global supply chains for a mid-sized medical device manufacturer. I tracked shipments of microscopic surgical steel across 3 continents. I trusted spreadsheets. I trusted vendor accountability. I trusted the undeniable reality that if you source your materials correctly and respect the timeline, the end product will be flawless. I applied this exact same clinical precision to my family. Since our mother passed away 8 years ago, I had taken over the mantle of the Miller family Thanksgiving. Our mother had been the glue of the family, and when she died, we were at risk of drifting apart. I refused to let that happen. Every November, I opened my home in the suburbs of Shaker Heights. I sourced a free-range heritage turkey from a local farm. I spent 3 days making pie crusts entirely from scratch, using frozen butter and ice water, just the way my mother had taught me. I did it because I loved my family, and because I believed that authentic, painstaking effort was the ultimate expression of care. Unfortunately, my younger brother, David, had recently introduced a new variable into the family ecosystem, a variable that was entirely allergic to authenticity. David was 32. He was a successful corporate software sales director, charming, handsome, and historically prone to dating women who looked incredible on a holiday card but possessed the emotional depth of a puddle. 14 months ago, he had married Chloe. Chloe was 26. She was a lifestyle influencer and aspiring interior designer who spoke almost entirely in Instagram captions. Everything about Chloe was curated, filtered, and profoundly hollow. She didn't have hobbies. She had aesthetics. She didn't have conversations. She delivered monologues about her upcoming brand partnerships. From the moment she officially entered the family, Chloe viewed me not as a sister-in-law, but as competition. Because I was a corporate director who wore tailored suits and preferred a quiet, organized life, Chloe decided I was stiff and traditional. She, on the other hand, was the fresh, vibrant, modern wife. She made a point of attempting to undermine my authority at every family gathering. If I hosted a summer barbecue, she would loudly critique the brand of charcoal I used. If I sent out coordinated family emails, she would purposefully ignore them and text David to ask for the details, forcing me to relay information twice. I rarely fought back. Arguing with someone who treats real life like a reality television show only provides them with the drama they crave. I simply maintained my boundaries, offered her a polite smile, and went back to my spreadsheets. But Thanksgiving was my territory. 2 weeks before the holiday, I sent out the standard family group email. It detailed the arrival time, the parking situation in my cul-de-sac, and the menu. Because I run a tight kitchen, I always explicitly state that I am handling the entire primary menu. If anyone wishes to contribute, they are welcome to bring wine, dinner rolls, or a specific dessert. Chloe replied, all. Brenda, so excited. But I just can't let you do all the heavy lifting. I am going to bring my family's famous generational green bean casserole. It is an absolute staple, and David just begs me to make it. You can just cross that off your little list. See you at 2 o'clock. I stared at the email on my monitor. The passive-aggressive insertion of little list, the blatant disregard for the menu parameters, the subtle implication that my cooking wouldn't be enough for her new husband. I didn't reply to the group. I simply adjusted my master spreadsheet, deleting my own recipe for haricot verts with toasted almonds, and inserting Chloe's casserole into the oven rotation schedule. If she wanted to contribute, I would give her the space to do so. Thanksgiving morning arrived with crisp, clear Ohio air. My house was a symphony of perfectly executed logistics. By 10 a.m., the heritage turkey was in the primary oven, draped in a butter-soaked cheesecloth. The cranberry compote was chilling in the secondary refrigerator. The dining room table was fully set with my mother's vintage china, polished silver, and a low, unobtrusive autumnal centerpiece that allowed for cross-table conversation. At 1:30 p.m., the family began to arrive. Aunts, uncles, and cousins flooded the entryway. The house filled with the warm, chaotic noise of laughter, clinking wine glasses, and the smell of roasting sage and thyme. Everything was proceeding flawlessly. At 2:45 p.m., 45 minutes late, David and Chloe finally arrived. They didn't just enter the house, they made an entrance. David was carrying 3 bottles of expensive Napa Valley Chardonnay. Chloe was wearing a pristine, cream-colored cashmere sweater that practically screamed spill hazard. And she was carrying a heavy glass 9x13 Pyrex dish covered tightly in aluminum foil. "We are so sorry we're late," Chloe announced to the crowded living room, practically glowing with the attention. "The holidays are just so crazy, and I was up since dawn perfecting this casserole. The cream sauce has to reduce for hours to get the right consistency. It's an absolute labor of love." The aunts and uncles immediately murmured their appreciation, fawning over the new bride's dedication. I walked out of the kitchen, wiping my hands on my apron. "Hello, Chloe. Happy Thanksgiving," I said politely, extending my hands. "I can take that for you. My secondary oven is currently holding at 200 degrees to keep the side dishes warm. I'll slip it right in." Chloe hesitated for a fraction of a second. She clutched the Pyrex dish a little tighter to her chest. "Oh no, Brenda, it's fine," Chloe said, a strange, tight smile flickering across her face. "It's actually in a thermal carrier under the foil. It's piping hot. It doesn't need to go in the oven at all. You can just put it straight on the serving buffet." "Are you sure?" I asked, my professional instincts briefly overriding my politeness. Food safety protocols generally dictate keeping dairy-based casseroles at a steady temperature until service. I have plenty of room. "I'm positive," Chloe laughed, a little too loudly, stepping past me and placing the dish directly onto the dining room buffet herself. "It's a very delicate recipe. My great-grandmother would roll over in her grave if I let it dry out in a warming oven. Just leave it there." I didn't press the issue. I nodded, turned around, and went back into the kitchen to manage the turkey carving. For the next hour, the house was consumed by the cocktail and appetizer phase. I moved through the kitchen with the mechanical precision of an air traffic controller. I delegated the potato mashing to my cousin, carved the turkey onto the heated silver platters, and began transferring the side dishes to the buffet. Through the open archway to the dining room, I could hear Chloe holding court. She was standing next to her Pyrex dish, a glass of Chardonnay in her hand, loudly explaining the history of her casserole to anyone who would listen. "It really is a lost art," Chloe sighed dramatically to my Aunt Martha. "People these days just open a can of soup and throw some frozen beans in a dish. But my family's recipe uses wild foraged mushrooms and a proprietary blend of fresh herbs. It takes hours of prep work. But you know me, I just refuse to compromise on authenticity. Aunt Martha, a sweet woman who genuinely believed the best in everyone, patted Chloe's arm. That is so wonderful, dear. David is a very lucky man to have a wife who appreciates traditional cooking. Brenda works so hard, but it's nice to see the younger generation stepping up. I paused in the doorway, holding a massive platter of roasted root vegetables. I didn't wince at the backhanded compliment. I just absorbed the data. Chloe was explicitly positioning herself as the culinary savior of the family, drawing a direct, unflattering comparison between my effort and her authenticity. At 4 p.m., I rang the small silver bell to announce dinner. 25 people descended upon the buffet. The line moved smoothly. When they reached Chloe's casserole, she practically preened, hovering nearby to watch them scoop the heavy, creamy green beans onto their plates. Because I am the hostess, I always eat last. I waited until the entire family was seated in the dining room and the adjoining breakfast nook. The noise of 25 people eating and talking was deafening. I took my own plate and walked down the buffet line. I took a slice of turkey. I took a scoop of stuffing. And then I reached Chloe's 9x13 Pyrex dish. I looked down at the generational family recipe. I am a logistician. I notice patterns. I notice consistencies. The green beans in the dish were perfectly mechanically uniform in length. The mushroom pieces suspended in the cream sauce were cut into exact, identical geometric cubes, a level of precision impossible to achieve by hand-chopping wild foraged mushrooms. Furthermore, the fried onion topping was saturated with a very specific, slightly artificial golden hue. I picked up the serving spoon. I scooped a small portion onto my plate. I walked into the kitchen, leaned against the granite island, and took a bite. I chewed slowly, letting the flavor profile hit my palate. It was extremely salty. It possessed the heavy, unmistakable mouthfeel of modified cornstarch thickeners and industrial sodium alginate. It tasted exactly like the preservatives used to extend the shelf life of commercial deli products. It was not a bad casserole, but it was absolutely, unequivocally not made from scratch. I swallowed the bite. I didn't feel angry. I felt the sharp, cold click of a puzzle piece falling into place. Chloe had claimed she was up since dawn making it. She had refused to let me put the Pyrex dish in the oven, claiming it was delicate, when in reality, she likely knew that heating a commercial plastic container in a thermal bag would melt the packaging, and she hadn't wanted me to see the transfer. But a supply chain always leaves a paper trail. You cannot manifest 5 pounds of pre-made commercial food without generating packaging waste. Chloe and David lived in a sleek downtown condo. They had driven 45 minutes to get here. If she had purchased a bulk commercial item and transferred it to her Pyrex dish before leaving her house, it would have been cold by the time she arrived. But the Pyrex dish had been piping hot when she walked through my front door, which meant she hadn't transferred it at home. She had transferred it en route, or, more likely, she had transferred it in my driveway, right before walking inside. I set my plate down on the island. I quietly walked out of the kitchen, slipping through the side door that led into my attached 2-car garage. The garage was cold and quiet, entirely insulated from the noise of the dining room. Lined up against the far wall were my 3 massive municipal recycling bins. Because I had been cooking for days, they were mostly full of broken-down cardboard boxes and rinsed aluminum cans. I walked over to the bins. I didn't dig. I didn't have to. Sitting right on top of the flattened cardboard in the primary bin, glistening with a faint residue of cream sauce, was a massive, rectangular, heavy-duty plastic deli container. I reached down and picked it up. It was a commercial catering tray, and plastered directly across the top of the clear plastic lid was a massive, unmistakable blue and white sticker. Kirkland Signature, Costco Wholesale, Green Bean Casserole. Net weight, 5.5 pounds. Keep refrigerated. Heating instructions. Remove lid and bake at 375 degrees for 40 minutes. The timestamp printed on the label indicated it had been purchased at the local Costco, located exactly 2 miles from my house, at 1:45 p.m. that very afternoon. The timeline was absolute. David and Chloe had driven from their condo, stopped at the local Costco, purchased a massive tray of pre-made deli casserole, heated it in the store's microwave or their car's portable warmer, pulled into my driveway, dumped the contents into a 9 by 13 glass Pyrex dish, thrown the evidence into my garage recycling bin, and walked through my front door claiming it was an heirloom masterpiece. I stood in the cold garage, holding the greasy Costco lid in my hands. My sister-in-law had just stood in my dining room, insulted my work ethic, accepted the fawning praise of my entire extended family, and lied straight to their faces. If you are the kind of person who storms back into the dining room, holds up the plastic lid, and screams at the top of your lungs, calling her a liar in front of 25 people, I understand you. It is a deeply human urge to demand immediate, explosive justice, but I am a supply chain director. I do not detonate the bridge while the cargo is still in transit. I wait until the enemy is standing directly in the center of the span, and then I quietly, methodically remove the support beams. I didn't scream. I didn't confront her. I took a paper towel from my apron, carefully wiped the cream sauce residue off the blue and white Kirkland signature label, and slipped the plastic lid into the deep pocket of my slacks. I walked back into the warm, chaotic house, entirely composed, ready to serve dessert. The dining room was a cacophony of satiated relatives, clinking silverware, and the heavy, lethargic warmth that always descends upon a house right after a massive Thanksgiving meal. I walked back into the room, my face a mask of perfect placid hostess decorum. My right hand was tucked into the deep pocket of my tailored wool slacks, my fingers resting lightly against the stiff, slightly greasy plastic of the Kirkland signature deli lid. It felt like holding a live wire, but my heart rate was completely steady. I did not announce my presence. I quietly began the process of clearing the secondary plates from the buffet, moving with the efficient, invisible grace of a caterer. At the main table, Chloe was still holding court. The level of sheer, breathtaking audacity required to maintain her lie was, from a purely psychological standpoint, almost fascinating to observe. In corporate supply chain management, when a fraudulent vendor attempts to pass off counterfeit materials as authentic, they usually do so quietly. They try to fly under the radar, hoping the sheer volume of the shipment will mask the inferior quality of the individual components. They do not typically stand in the middle of the receiving dock and loudly draw attention to the fake merchandise. But Chloe was not a professional. She was a social media influencer. Her entire existence was predicated on the belief that if you project an aesthetic loudly enough, reality will simply bend to accommodate it. It really is all about the blanching process, Chloe was explaining to my Uncle Robert, gesturing expansively with her wine glass. If you don't shock the green beans in an ice bath at the exact right second, they lose that vibrant snap. And the cream sauce, well, I can't give away all the family secrets, but let's just say it involves a very specific, slow-simmered roux. It took me 3 hours this morning just to get the consistency right. My brother David was sitting next to her, looking at his new wife with absolute, oblivious adoration. She was up before the sun, Uncle Robert, David chimed in, placing a proprietary hand on Chloe's shoulder. I told her to take it easy. Maybe just buy something from the bakery, but you know Chloe. She is an absolute perfectionist. She wouldn't dream of bringing something store-bought to Brenda's table. I paused behind David's chair, holding a stack of empty salad plates. I looked at my brother. I wondered, briefly, if he was complicit in the lie. Had he stood in the Costco checkout line with her? Had he helped her transfer the industrial sodium-heavy mass into the Pyrex dish in the heated seats of his luxury SUV? Looking at the earnest, proud expression on his face, I realized he was completely innocent. David was a software salesman. He understood profit margins, but he possessed zero domestic awareness. He likely believed that because Chloe had spent 3 hours in their kitchen with the door closed, probably recording makeup tutorials or scrolling through Instagram, she was actually cooking. He was a willing, entirely oblivious pawn in her performative fiction. Well, it is absolutely divine, Chloe, Aunt Martha said, dabbing her mouth with a linen napkin. You simply must write the recipe down for me before you leave. I would love to try making it for the church potluck next month. I watched Chloe's face carefully. A microscopic tremor of panic flashed behind her perfectly contoured eyes. A lie requires a supply chain of its own to maintain. If you claim to possess a generational recipe, you must eventually produce the formula. But you cannot produce a recipe for a dish engineered in a commercial food laboratory by Costco food scientists. Oh, Aunt Martha, I would love to, Chloe laughed, a high, breathy sound that was entirely devoid of genuine warmth. But it's one of those recipes that isn't really written down anywhere. It's all by feel, you know? A pinch of this, a dash of that. My great-grandmother never measured anything, and neither do I. I'm not sure I could even translate it to paper, if I tried. That is the mark of a true natural chef, David beamed. I picked up the empty gravy boat. If everyone is finished with the main course, I announced quietly, my voice slicing smoothly through the chatter, I will begin clearing the table for coffee and pie. Chloe immediately pushed her chair back, a performative look of helpfulness washing over her face. Oh, Brenda, let me help you. You have been on your feet all day. Sit down, let the new Mrs. Miller take over the cleanup. It was a classic, textbook maneuver. She wanted to be seen by the family as the gracious, helpful guest, offering to relieve the tired, overworked hostess. She wanted the optical credit for helping, without actually having to do the grueling, invisible labor of scraping plates and loading the dishwasher. Thank you, Chloe, but no, I said, offering her a smile that was perfectly polite and entirely impenetrable. You have already contributed so much with your labor-intensive casserole. Please remain seated. Relax. I have a system in the kitchen, and it's much faster if I execute it alone. Are you sure? Chloe pressed, looking around the table to ensure the aunts and uncles were witnessing her generosity. I really don't mind. I am absolute sure, I replied. Enjoy your wine. I spent the next 20 minutes engaged in the highly choreographed ballet of table clearing. I moved back and forth between the dining room and the kitchen, scraping turkey bones into the compost, stacking the vintage china, and loading the industrial dishwasher. I did not rush. I allowed the heavy, satisfied digestion of the family to settle the room into a quiet, comfortable lull. I brewed a massive pot of dark roast coffee. I pulled the 3 pies, pumpkin, pecan, and a lattice-top apple, out of the warming ovens. As I arranged the dessert plates, my fingers brushed against the stiff plastic lid hidden in my pocket. I am not a vindictive person. I do not believe in public executions. If Chloe had simply brought the Costco casserole and quietly placed it on the table without comment, I would not have cared. There is no shame in utilizing a commercial shortcut when feeding a massive crowd. But Chloe had not been quiet. She had weaponized the casserole. She had used a mass-produced $5 deli item to explicitly elevate her own status, while simultaneously diminishing the authentic, grueling labor I had poured into the day. She had looked my family in the eye and lied to them to steal their admiration. In supply chain logistics, when you identify a counterfeit component, you do not simply throw it away. You document it. You return it to the vendor. You force them to acknowledge the discrepancy, ensuring they understand that their fraud was detected, categorized, and rejected. I placed the 3 pies onto a large silver serving tray. I arranged the dessert forks and the stack of small linen napkins. I carried the heavy tray out into the dining room. The family perked up immediately at the smell of cinnamon, nutmeg, and caramelized butter. I set the tray down on the buffet. Dessert is served, I announced. We have traditional pumpkin, deep dish apple, and a bourbon pecan. Please help yourselves. The uncles and cousins began to slowly migrate toward the buffet, drawn by the sugar. David stood up, stretching his arms. Brenda, the meal was fantastic, as always, but I think Chloe's green beans were the unexpected MVP this year, don't you think? He was practically begging for my validation. He wanted his older sister to bless his new wife's domestic triumph. I looked at David. I looked at Chloe, who was remaining seated at the table, a smug, incredibly self-satisfied smile playing on her lips. She believed she had won. She believed she had successfully usurped the Thanksgiving crown, using nothing but a plastic container and a complete lack of shame. The casserole was certainly remarkable, I said smoothly, turning my attention to the coffee service. I poured a cup of dark roast coffee for Aunt Martha. I poured one for Uncle Robert. I picked up the carafe and walked over to where Chloe was sitting. Coffee, Chloe? I asked politely. Chloe held up her half-empty wine glass, the crystal catching the light from the chandelier. Oh, no thank you, Brenda. Chloe sighed, leaning back in her chair and crossing her legs. I think I'm going to stick with the Chardonnay. I am just absolutely exhausted. Cooking from scratch really does take it out of you, doesn't it? She was pushing it. She couldn't help herself. She had to take one final arrogant victory lap. It certainly does, I agreed softly. It requires a great deal of transparency. I set the coffee carafe down on the table. I reached into the deep pocket of my slacks. The dining room was loud. The uncles were debating football near the buffet. The aunts were complimenting the flaky layers of my pie crust. No one was looking directly at us except David, who was standing a few feet away, waiting for a slice of pecan. I pulled the large clear plastic deli lid out of my pocket. Because I had wiped it clean with a paper towel in the garage, the blue and white Kirkland signature sticker was pristine. The bold black text reading Costco Wholesale Green Bean Casserole, net weight, 5.5 pounds was flawlessly legible. I didn't hold it up in the air. I didn't announce it to the room. I simply stepped forward, reaching out toward Chloe's place setting. Please, allow me, I said quietly, my voice barely carrying over the background noise. You don't want to leave a water ring on the mahogany. With slow, absolute clinical precision, I placed the massive rectangular plastic Costco lid directly onto the polished wood of the dining table, right in front of Chloe. Then I gently took her crystal wine glass and placed it squarely in the center of the blue and white Kirkland sticker. I used the counterfeit evidence as a coaster. I didn't break eye contact with her. I stood perfectly straight, my hands folded neatly in front of my apron, projecting the calm, terrifying authority of an auditor who has just closed the ledger. For 2 seconds, Chloe didn't understand what was happening. She looked down at the table, annoyed that I was interfering with her place setting. Her eyes focused on the plastic lid. She read the word Kirkland. She read the words green bean casserole. The physical transformation of her body was instantaneous and catastrophic. The smug, self-satisfied smile vanished as if it had been wiped off her face with a wet rag. All the blood drained from her perfectly contoured cheeks, leaving her looking pale, hollow, and absolutely terrified. Her breath hitched in her throat, a sharp, audible gasp that she quickly tried to stifle. She looked up at me. Her eyes were wide, frantic, and filled with the sheer, unadulterated panic of a fraud who realizes they are standing entirely naked in the spotlight. She knew exactly what I had done. She knew that I had gone into the garage, dug through the recycling, found her packaging, and quietly carried it back into the room to execute her. She opened her mouth, but her vocal cords completely failed her. She had no script for this. Instagram captions do not cover the protocol for when your sister-in-law formally audits your lies in total silence. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I maintained a gaze of absolute, chilling neutrality. I hope the vintage pairs well with the preservatives, I whispered, my voice so low that only she could hear it. David, noticing the sudden bizarre freeze in his wife's posture, stepped closer. Everything okay over here? David asked, looking between the two of us, entirely failing to notice the massive plastic lid sitting under Chloe's wine glass. Chloe flinched at the sound of his voice. If David looked down, if David read the label, her entire facade of the perfect traditional wife would shatter in front of his eyes. She would be exposed not just to me, but to the husband she had been actively lying to all afternoon. Her hand shot out. With a speed born of pure, adrenaline-fueled desperation, Chloe grabbed her wine glass with her right hand and slapped her left hand flat over the Kirkland signature sticker, physically covering the evidence with her palm. Yes, Chloe squeaked, her voice cracking under the strain, pitching an entire octave higher than normal. Yes, everything is perfect, David. Brenda was just giving me a coaster. A coaster? David frowned, looking at her hand plastered to the table. Chloe, you're shaking. Are you feeling all right? I'm fine, she insisted frantically, her face now flushing a deep, humiliating crimson. I think the heat of the kitchen is finally getting to me. I have a bit of a headache. I am so sorry to hear that, Chloe, I said smoothly, picking up the coffee carafe again. If you need to excuse yourself to the guest bathroom, please feel free. I can manage the dessert service from here. Chloe looked up at me. The absolute defeat in her eyes was profound. She wasn't just embarrassed, she was entirely neutralized. She realized with crystal clarity that I held the absolute power to destroy her reputation in front of the entire family with a single sentence, and I was actively choosing to hold it over her head instead. I hadn't just exposed her lie. I had established a permanent, unbreakable boundary. I think I just need some water, Chloe stammered, unable to move her left hand from the plastic lid, effectively pinning herself to the table. Of course, I said graciously. David, why don't you get your wife a glass of ice water from the kitchen? She looks a bit flushed. Right away, David said, turning and hurrying toward the kitchen, completely oblivious to the silent execution that had just occurred. I looked down at Chloe one last time. It really was a labor of love, Chloe, I said softly. The logistics of the transfer must have been exhausting. I turned my back on her and walked over to the dessert buffet to slice the pecan pie. The rest of the evening was an absolute masterclass in psychological containment. I stood at the buffet, slicing the lattice-top apple pie, watching the scene at the dining table unfold in my peripheral vision. David returned from the kitchen a moment later, holding a glass of ice water. He set it down in front of Chloe, looking at her with genuine concern. Here you go, babe, David said, rubbing her shoulder. Drink up. You've been running around since 6 o'clock this morning. You probably just dehydrated yourself making that roux. Chloe grabbed the water glass with her right hand and took a frantic, desperate gulp. Her left hand remained absolutely plastered to the mahogany table, her knuckles white from the pressure she was applying to the Costco lid hidden beneath her palm. Thanks, Chloe managed to croak, refusing to look in my direction. Do you want to go lay down in the guest room? David asked. Brenda wouldn't mind. No, Chloe said quickly, the idea of leaving the table, and thereby exposing the massive, greasy plastic label to her husband, clearly terrifying her. No, I just need to sit here for a minute. I'm fine. I plated a slice of pecan pie, handed it to my Uncle Robert, and allowed the tension to stretch. Watching Chloe navigate the next 15 minutes was like watching a cornered animal try to gnaw off its own leg to escape a trap. She was physically anchored to the table. She couldn't use her phone. She couldn't comfortably eat her dessert. And she certainly couldn't continue her loud, arrogant monologues about her generational culinary skills. Every time someone complimented the dinner, Chloe simply offered a tight, miserable nod. Eventually, the aunts and uncles began to migrate toward the living room to watch the evening football game. David was pulled into a conversation with his cousins by the fireplace. For a brief, 30-second window, Chloe was left entirely alone at the far end of the dining table. I was wiping down the granite island in the kitchen, observing her through the archway. Chloe looked around the room, her eyes darting frantically to ensure no one was watching her. She didn't check the kitchen. She grabbed her oversized designer handbag from the floor, pulled it onto her lap, and unzipped it with one hand. Then, in a single, lightning-fast motion, she slid the large blue and white Kirkland signature plastic lid off the table, shoved it deep into the expensive leather lining of her purse, and zipped it shut. She let out a long, ragged exhale, slumping back into her chair as if she had just defused a bomb. She thought she was safe. She thought she had successfully disposed of the evidence. She had absolutely no idea that in supply chain auditing, once the fraud is documented and presented to the offending vendor, the physical evidence is no longer required. The psychological receipt has already been issued. I folded my dish towel, walked out of the kitchen, and approached the table to collect her empty wine glass. Chloe flinched as I stepped into her peripheral vision. She clutched her designer purse tightly against her stomach. Are you feeling any better, Chloe? I asked, my voice entirely devoid of sarcasm. It was the flat, polite tone of a corporate professional confirming the receipt of an invoice. Chloe looked up at me. The arrogant, Instagram-filtered bravado was completely gone. She looked exhausted, thoroughly neutralized, and deeply cautious. I'm fine, Brenda, she said quietly. Just a headache. I understand, I replied, picking up her crystal glass. High-volume production can be incredibly taxing on the system, especially when you are managing the logistics all by yourself. She swallowed hard, dropping her gaze to the polished wood of the table. Right. Would you like me to wash your Pyrex dish before you leave? I offered smoothly. I wouldn't want you to have to scrub any artificial thickeners out of the glass when you get home. It can be quite stubborn. Chloe's jaw tightened. She knew exactly what I was doing. I was driving the final, unshakable nail into the boundary line. That won't be necessary, Chloe muttered, her voice barely a whisper. I'll handle it. Suit yourself, I said, offering her a final, impenetrable smile. It was lovely of you to contribute. The family certainly enjoyed the presentation. I turned and walked back to the kitchen, leaving her sitting alone at the empty table, her hands wrapped tightly around the handles of her purse. The rest of the holiday gathering proceeded exactly as a family Thanksgiving should, loud, warm, and utterly drama-free. Without Chloe aggressively attempting to hijack the center of attention, the natural, comfortable rhythm of the family restored itself. Aunt Martha told stories about my mother. Uncle Robert fell asleep in the recliner. The cousins played board games on the floor. I moved through my home with the quiet, unbothered satisfaction of a captain navigating a massive ship through a perfectly charted harbor. At 8 p.m., the family began to pack up their leftovers and say their goodbyes. David walked into the kitchen, carrying Chloe's empty 9x13 Pyrex dish. "Hey, Bren," David said, wrapping his arm around my shoulder for a quick brotherly hug. "Thank you again. You always outdo yourself. Mom would be incredibly proud of how you keep everyone together." "It's my pleasure, David," I said honestly, returning the hug. "I love having you all here." "Chloe's feeling pretty under the weather, so we're going to hit the road," David explained, setting the glass dish on the island. "She really wanted to wash this for you, but I told her you had an industrial dishwasher and wouldn't mind." "Not at all," I said. "Drive safe. Tell Chloe I hope she feels better." I watched them leave from the front window. Chloe walked briskly down the driveway, her head down, clutching her purse, practically diving into the passenger seat of David's SUV. She didn't wave goodbye. She didn't offer a final performative Instagram pose. She simply wanted to escape the perimeter of my authority as quickly as possible. The taillights of their car disappeared around the bend of the cul-de-sac. I locked the front door, turned off the porch light, and walked back into my quiet, immaculate kitchen. I loaded the final batch of vintage china into the dishwasher, wiped down the counters, and turned off the overhead lights. The operation was complete. The logistics were flawless, and the hostiles had been successfully repelled without a single raised voice. The fallout from that Thanksgiving was subtle, but permanent. Chloe never mentioned the generational green bean casserole ever again. In fact, her behavior at subsequent family gatherings underwent a radical, fascinating transformation. When Christmas arrived a month later, I hosted a smaller, more intimate brunch. Chloe and David attended, but Chloe didn't bring a competing dish. She didn't loudly critique my menu, and she didn't attempt to position herself as the culinary matriarch of the family. She walked into my house carrying a very expensive, commercially sealed bottle of French champagne. "Brenda," Chloe had said, handing me the bottle at the door, her eyes carefully avoiding mine, "we brought you some champagne. I didn't want to step on your toes in the kitchen." "Thank you, Chloe," I had replied, taking the bottle. "That is very thoughtful. Store-bought is perfectly fine." She had blinked, a brief flash of terror crossing her face, before nodding quickly and retreating to the living room. She had finally learned the most vital rule of interacting with a supply chain auditor. If you are going to outsource your labor, you must properly disclose your vendors. She stopped trying to compete with me. The passive-aggressive emails ceased. The loud, arrogant monologues about her authenticity disappeared whenever she was in my house. She realized that my quietness was not weakness. It was the terrifying, observant silence of a woman who tracks every single discrepancy on the ledger. She knew that I held the Costco receipt to her entire domestic persona, and she was entirely unwilling to risk another audit. David remains blissfully unaware of the silent war that was fought and won in his sister's dining room. He still thinks his wife makes an incredible casserole, though he frequently complains that she refuses to ever make it again, claiming it is simply too much work. I let him believe it. I am not interested in destroying my brother's marriage. I am only interested in protecting the integrity of my own home and the dignity of my own labor. People ask me sometimes if I regret not calling her out in front of the entire family. They ask if I should have held the plastic lid up in the air and publicly shamed her for lying to our aunts and uncles. I always give them the exact same answer. Public executions are messy. They cause collateral damage. If I had screamed at Chloe, I would have ruined Thanksgiving for everyone. David would have been humiliated, Aunt Martha would have been upset, and Chloe would have simply played the victim, claiming I was a jealous, unhinged bully who was picking on the new bride over a piece of plastic. When you fight a narcissist in public, you give them the exact currency they crave: attention. But when you execute them in absolute silence, utilizing undeniable, physical proof that only they can see, you strip them of their audience. You force them to sit in the suffocating reality of their own fraud, entirely unable to defend themselves without exposing their own lie. I didn't need the family to know that she was a fake. I only needed her to know that I knew she was a fake. You cannot counterfeit genuine effort. You cannot buy authenticity in a bulk packaged plastic container. And you can never, ever expect to disrespect the grueling, invisible labor of the women who hold the family together without eventually facing the audit. That is my story. A 25-person holiday deployment, a mass-produced deli item, and the exact moment a social media influencer realized she had tried to fake a supply chain in front of the director. If you have ever been the backbone of an operation, the one who quietly works behind the scenes to ensure the machinery of the family runs smoothly, only to watch someone else try to steal the credit, take this as your absolute vindication. Do not shout. Do not throw a tantrum. Do not try to reason with people who live in a filtered, performative reality. Quietly secure your perimeter. Gather your data. Collect the physical receipts. And when they finally step into the light to claim your victory, calmly, politely, and silently place the evidence directly under their glass. Let them drink the reality of what they actually are. Thank you for spending your time with me today. If this story reminded you to always check the recycling bin and to never underestimate the quiet ones in the kitchen, please share it with someone who needs the strength to enforce their own boundaries. Drop a comment below with the word audited to let me know you stayed until the final slice of pie. Hit that subscribe button for more true stories about calm, absolute victories, and I will see you in the next drama story.